He also had some policy ideas he was floating in these meeting rooms today.
Yeah, he talked a lot about tax policy. He wants to raise tariffs in order to, he said, reduce the individual income tax rates. Usually when he's talking about tariffs, he's talking about it in terms of protectionism, in terms of protecting American workers and industries, and as a matter of trade policy. Here he's incorporating it into a larger developing tax policy ahead of the expiration of the Trump tax cuts next year. And he also talked about reducing the corporate tax rate from 21% to 20%. Which is a little bit of a departure from his thinking earlier in the year when he was thinking, no, the cuts are all going to be on the individual side. I've done everything I can do on the corporate side. But he says 20% is a nice round number. Trump likes round numbers. So we talked about the split screen campaign here with Trump here in Washington and President Biden at the G7 in Italy. In both cases, you had guys trying to show that they can govern. This is a departure from the Trump that we've seen at the courthouse in New York ranting against witch hunts. The message today was, elect me and I can work with members of these Congress to get something done.
Of course, if they had acted all of these, they made the tax cuts permanent, cut the corporate tax rate further. According to research by the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, it would add upwards of $5 trillion to the deficit. Donald Trump spoke as well to the Business Roundtable today. 90 prominent CEOs, maybe more, showed up. Kailey was outside this conversation earlier. Tim Cook, Jamie Dimon listening to this. Are they not concerned about ballooning deficits while we're concerned about inflation?
Oh, I think there's some concern across the spectrum about both President Biden and former President Trump. Neither of their policies have been particularly friendly to budget hawks who want to see us make some progress on debt, particularly as a percentage of GDP.
Yeah.
But, when you're talking to a corporate crowd, they like hearing about those corporate tax cuts. And so I think that's what they were responding to.
It's interesting that some of these executives were pretty vocal after January 6th in opposition of Donald Trump and what had gone down that day that now seem to be warming back up to him. And I have to say, as lawmakers were walking in the room, there were protesters outside suggesting, you're supporting an insurrectionist. Mike Pence was about to hang, trying to remind lawmakers of this. Even Mitt Romney, who voted to impeach Donald Trump, attended this meeting. What is his return to the Capitol for the first time since January 6th happened? Mind you, show us about how far we've come in politics since that day.
Also extraordinary, I think, what we've seen reporting that President Trump endorsed Larry Hogan for Senate behind closed doors. Larry Hogan, of course, a Republican former governor of Maryland who considered running against Trump under a third-party banner. And now, apparently, they seem to maybe have been reconciled. President Trump, if he's going to get reelected, if he's going to get anything done, would like a Republican Senate and a Republican House. And so the message of today seemed to be the party is unifying around him, and that Trump wants not just to be elected president, but he wants a governing majority to enact a lot of these policies we've been talking about.
You have to admit, though, and I think you're pointing to this, Kailey, if you went back to January 7th, 2020, and predicted this day here and the reception that Donald Trump got coming back to Washington, no one would have believed you. Bloomberg's Gregory and Korte, we thank you so much for the time and the insights today on Balance of Power. The Supreme Court, in a unanimous decision this morning, also, as we mentioned, upholding access to the abortion pill Mifepristone. Speaker Mike Johnson addressed the politics of abortion after House Republicans met with Donald Trump.
President Trump, the way he addressed the issue this morning is he said, make sure that you exercise your own conscience, talk about it, share your conviction, and do that in a way that makes sense to people. And I think he had made a good point. He has said that after the Dobbs decision that the states are handling the issue right now, and that's where he's comfortable keeping it. And we've made the point that before you can have political consensus on a difficult issue, you have to have cultural consensus. And right now, we just don't have the numbers in Congress to do anything on the federal level, and that's just the reality.
As we now add the voice of Bloomberg's Saleha Mohsin at the table with us here in Washington. Saleha, your thoughts on this ruling today that came roughly a moment or two roughly after 10 a.m., just as Donald Trump was speaking in the meetings that we're describing here today, maybe the biggest gift politically that he got during his visit to Washington. Would you agree?
Well, what we saw happen was that the Dobbs ruling really energized this issue for Democrats. And what we've the information that now we have from the Supreme Court, this ruling kind of takes the teeth away from the Democratic Party in trying to say that this is going to be the reason, this and January 6th are the reasons that people should go to polls and vote for Biden. That risk has been kind of neutralized for the GOP. And so, yeah, for like you're saying, Joe, there's a little bit of a gift here. The thing is that there's still a down ballot effect in some states that are GOP majorities run by GOP governors and state legislatures. There is still an issue to contend with here, and that does start to affect down ballot.
He just didn't have to answer to this in the same way he would have if it had been struck down.
Certainly. Well, and I wonder about what the justices have to answer to as well. Of course, they're appointed for life. They don't have to be reelected like other lawmakers. But we know that the court as an institution has seen its credibility and its faith among the American electorate degrading in recent years. And part of that may have to do with the Dobbs decision. Does this potentially add more credibility back to the court?
It just might. You know, there's been studies and polling from Pew Research and Gallup that have revealed that government trust at a historic low. And a lot of that has to do with the Supreme Court, the Dobbs ruling, the ethics scandal with Clarence Thomas, and the other sort of smoke around that fire at the Supreme Court. And so now what we're seeing is that maybe they are meeting the public where they're at when it comes to abortion politics. And also, if we're going to think about who this affects the most, suburban women, right? And that's an important constituency in the upcoming election.